Commander-in-Chief, and what responsibilities the Congress must meet under the provision requiring that Congress shall declare war. We must balance the strong need to show unity and to speak with one voice to the rest of the world at a time of crisis against the necessity in a democracy of allowing the people themselves to have their rightful voice heard in such critical decisions which affect the future of us all. We must ponder how all of the changes in the world, including the end of the Cold War and the rise of economic competition as the main determinant of national strength, affect what we should do. One thing is clear: the greatest threat to our national security in the long run is our potential failure to change our thinking to coincide with all of the changes in the world around us. We must weigh the benefit of spending our limited tax dollars to reinstate the government of Kuwait against the benefit of spending those same dollars to restore our economic strength at home through increased private investment in productivity and public investment in education and infrastructure. Which choice in the long run will do more to ensure America's strength and leadership in the world? None of these choices are easy to make. And this is one of those times in which each of us alone must in conscience make a decision based solely on what we think is best for America. This is one of those situations in which it would not be morally right for any of us to pressure our colleagues for political or partisan reasons to vote one way or another. I do not think that anyone here would dispute that I have consistently supported in a bipartisan way our presidents in times of crisis and supported the use of force to protect our national interests when necessary. It is also known by our congressional leaders and by the White House that I've done my best through private communication to affect policy in this area. Only the strongest feeling of obligation to my country would cause me to publicly urge a change in the President's policy. I feel such an obligation at this time. I also feel that Congress has no choice but to have this debate at this difficult time. We have no option if we are to perform our constitutional duty. As Senator Nunn has said, there are many gray areas and conflicts where Congress has permitted and supported military action by the President as Commander-in-Chief without explicit authorization or a declaration of war. I have myself supported such action in the past in places like Grenada, Libya, and Panama. Had the President acted to destroy by targeted strikes the chemical, nuclear, and biological warfare facilities of Iraq, I would have fully supported that action without a declaration of war. But as my colleague from Georgia has indicated, ordering more than 400,000 American troops into battle to restore the previous government of Kuwait is no gray area. Clearly, if the constitutional provision requiring Congress to declare war has any meaning at all, it is applicable to this situation. There is no way, therefore, we can duck or dodge our own responsibility. We must do our duty under the Constitution. If war does come, I will support our troops 100% and vote to provide anything they need to achieve victory as quickly as possible. While we may have our differences of opinion in this Congress about how to proceed, Saddam Hussein, and indeed the entire world, should by now have the clear message that if war does come, Americans will unite for total and complete victory. We want no more Vietnams, and we will not fight with one hand tied behind our backs. However, I cannot at this time in conscience vote to initiate a full-scale war to restore the government of Kuwait if 90% of the risks and 90% of the burdens will be borne by America, while other nations like Japan and Germany sit on the sidelines not doing their share. The lives of young Americans are the real treasure of our nation and our most precious possession. They should be put at risk only for some urgent national interest or great cause. I do not believe that restoring the Emir's government in Kuwait is vital enough to America's national interest to potentially risk thousands of lives and billions of dollars, while others have made only a token contribution to the effort. Restoration of the government of Kuwait ranks far down the list of priority interests of our country, certainly below the protection of Saudi Arabia from invasion and the release of American hostages, both of which have been accomplished, and the destruction of Iraq's chemical, nuclear, and biological capacity, which can be destroyed by methods far short of a major ground war. Before we act, we must think long and hard about the end result of our action if we are to intelligently decide whether the costs outweigh the potential benefits. While all of us hope that war would be short, decisive, and with few casualties if it comes, there's also a considerable risk, according to most experts I have heard in both open and closed classified sessions, that it could last for months rather than for days, and it could be extremely costly. While we hope and pray that that would not be the case, we are obligated to ask ourselves if such a war is in our national interest, if it does end up costing us thousands of casualties and tens and perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars. Estimates of the financial cost of all-out war range as high as from $1 to $2 billion per day. If such a scenario developed, we could end up with our nation badly divided because of the loss of life, suffering from a new wave of isolationism, and $100 billion or $200 billion more in debt. That would mean that if nations like Germany and Japan did very little, we would end up further behind in our ability to compete with them in the future. We could, if we are not careful, end up fighting a war and sacrificing precious lives and spending scarce dollars in a way that promotes Japanese interests, for example, more than our own. Not only is it not prudent for the United States to bear so much of the cost by itself, it is not right. Japan obtains 70% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, and we get only 13% of our oil from this region. Why should we bear a greater burden than they do for establishing a new world order which polices aggression around the world and protects the stability of the Middle East? It is sometimes said that the Cold War is over and that we're the only remaining superpower in the world. And while it's true that we're the only nation able to respond quickly enough to prevent an invasion of Saudi Arabia, we are ourselves not a superpower in the sense that we were in 1950 at the beginning of the Cold War. At that time, we had 70% of the world's wealth and 70% of the world's markets, 9 of the 10 largest banks in the world, and the largest highest per capita income in the world. Today, we have none of the top 20 banks, a lower per capita income than Japan, and a potentially smaller market than the new European Common Market, which comes into place in 1992. We must realize that our resources are limited. If we spend up to $200 billion while others do not help us, that money won't be available for us to spend on investment by the private sector to restore our economic strength and productivity. That money won't be available to spend on our educational system and infrastructure. That money won't be available to spend to solve the social problems which erode our strength and our ability to compete with the rest of the world. We must ask ourselves whether spending this money to return the Emir to Kuwait will do more to create a strong America in the 21st century than investing it to rebuild our strength here at home. Before we act, we must also consider the ultimate effect of our actions on the Middle East as well as on America. If Iraq is totally destroyed, a power vacuum will develop, which will be filled at least in part by Syria and Iran. These nations could hardly be described as guardians of American interests. In addition, large numbers of civilian casualties caused by American military actions could engender strong anti-American feelings, which could undermine support for pro-American Arab governments in their own countries. There's another disturbing element of the current situation, Mr. President, that should be addressed at the appropriate time, not in the heat of this crisis. If war comes, some Americans will end up bearing far more of their share of the sacrifice than others. Very few of those in leadership positions in our country, including the members of Congress and the members of the Cabinet, have children or grandchildren serving in the Middle East. Most of the troops come from the middle and lower income families. Many join Reserve or National Guard units because they must supplement their living or educational expenses. We must make sure that we always remember that even if our own children are not there, those troops have mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and children who love them just as much as we love our own children. At some point in the future, we should ask ourselves if it is healthy for our nation that when a crisis comes, Americans from all walks of life do not bear the same amount of risk. In World War II, by contrast, we were all in it together. As I said at the outset, at a time like this, we must forget whether we are Democrats or Republicans and speak as Americans. I do not rise for the purpose of criticizing our president. He's a good and decent man who's doing his best to bear a terrible burden for all of us. No one can possibly understand the full nature of the responsibility which he must feel. The president deserves great credit for what he's already achieved. Because of his decisive action, Iraqi aggression has been stopped, Saudi Arabia has not been invaded, and our hostages have been freed. I would fully support additional actions by the president to target and destroy Iraqi chemical, nuclear, and biological facilities. And I believe that the president could act lawfully as commander-in-chief to hit such limited targets without explicit advance congressional authorization. We must remember, as we confront the current situation, that patience and containment have proven their value in the past. It was containment that eventually brought down the communist bloc without a nuclear war. Because of our show of strength, Iraq's military advance has been totally stopped, and it's growing weaker every day because of the most effective economic blockade in this century. I support the pending resolution because it makes it clear that we support many of the actions taken by the president. It explicitly authorizes the use of force to enforce economic sanctions, to defend Saudi Arabia, and to protect our troops. It provides the president with a procedure under which he can be assured of a quick response from Congress if he requests authority to wage war. It also urges the president, before launching a full-scale war, to restore the government of Kuwait, to give more time for economic sanctions to further weaken Iraq. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I have carefully monitored the effect which sanctions are having on Iraq and Saddam's government. Experts in the intelligence community have drawn varying conclusions of their own, but they all agree that from a factual point of view, Iraq's exports have been virtually stopped 100%. Imports have been cut by 90%. GMP has been cut in half. Hard currency will soon be totally depleted because there are no earnings from their exports. This means that soon they will not be able to pay for the small trickle of items now being smuggled into the country. The press has reported that food rationing coupons are now redeemable at lesser amounts of food than was the case a few weeks ago. Motor oil, transmission fluid, and lubricants are clearly in very short supply. While experts may differ as to whether sanctions alone will force Saddam out of Kuwait, none of the experts, not a single one, that has testified before the Intelligence Committee in public or in private has disagreed that as each day passes with sanctions in place, Iraq will become weaker. All of the experts have also indicated some deterioration in their military capacity as well. Even if we do decide to ultimately fight, it would be far better to fight a foe which has been weakened further rather than to launch an immediate full-scale attack. Since we've already waited this long to act instead of fighting soon after the arrival of our forces, it makes sense to give sanctions more time to weaken our adversary. In addition, this resolution correctly urges that the contributions from other nations be substantially increased before we act.